Tell us, Muse, of the man carried far from home, who crossed unfamiliar seas, entered strange halls, and learned how difficult it can be to return as the person who once departed. His home was Ithaca, a steep island of stone, olive trees, narrow paths, and protected coves. It was neither the grandest nor the richest kingdom, yet every part of it belonged to memory. In the harbor, ropes moved against an empty mooring where the king's ship might have rested. 10 years of war had passed, followed by nearly 10 more years without certain news. Odysseus had helped the Greeks capture Troy, but victory had not brought him home. Travelers carried rumors rather than answers, and each rumor faded before it could become proof. His wife Penelope remained in the palace, where she measured the years through household duties and patient decisions. At her loom, each crossing thread gave shape to time that otherwise seemed shapeless. Powerful young men from Ithaca and nearby islands entered the household as suitors. They claimed that Odysseus must be dead, and demanded that Penelope choose one of them as her husband. The suitors did not wait with restraint. Day after day they consumed cattle, goats, bread, and wine from Odysseus's estate, turning another man's hospitality into an occupation of his home. Odysseus's son Telemachus sat among them, old enough to understand the insult, but not yet strong enough to end it. He had grown up beneath the shadow of a father he could barely remember. Other people described Odysseus as clever, commanding, persuasive, and dangerous when opposed. For Telemachus, these qualities belonged to stories because childhood had preserved almost no clear image of the man himself. Far above the island, the gods considered the long imbalance. Poseidon still opposed Odysseus, but the sea god was traveling beyond the familiar world, leaving a brief opening for change. Athena, goddess of wisdom and disciplined strategy, had never forgotten the wanderer. She reminded Zeus that Odysseus remained trapped far away while disorder continued to spread through his household. The gods could not simply erase every consequence, yet they could create possibilities. Athena chose to begin not with Odysseus, but with the uncertain young man waiting inside his father's house. Disguised as a traveler named Mentes, Athena crossed the sea and approached the palace gate. Telemachus noticed the stranger before the suitors did and hurried forward to offer a proper welcome. He accepted the visitor's spear, offered a seat, and ordered food before asking a name or purpose. In a disordered house, Telemachus still remembered that hospitality began with care rather than suspicion. Away from the loudest tables, Telemachus admitted his fear that Odysseus would never return. He described the waste, the pressure on Penelope, and his own uncertainty about what authority he possessed. Mentes answered with confidence. Odysseus, the visitor said, was not a man easily held forever. Telemachus should stop living as though every decision depended on news arriving from somewhere else. The first instruction was public: summon the people of Ithaca and name the suitors' behavior before them. Even if the assembly failed, silence would no longer make the occupation appear acceptable. The second instruction reached beyond Ithaca. Telemachus should sail to Pylos in Sparta, where veterans of Troy might know whether his father had survived the road home. As the conversation continued, Telemachus began to sit differently. No miracle had solved his problems, but a path now existed, and a path can change the weight of an uncertain future. In the center of the hall, the singer Phemius performed a sorrowful song about the Greeks returning from Troy. The subject traveled upward through the palace and reached Penelope's private rooms. Penelope came down the stair with 2 attendants. She asked the singer to choose another story, because this one reopened a grief that had never been given a proper ending. For the first time, Telemachus answered his mother before the whole hall. The singer, he said, was not responsible for the sorrows he described, and the household could not forbid every painful song. Penelope heard something new in her son's voice. She returned upstairs thoughtfully, while the suitors exchanged glances. The quiet young man they had dismissed was beginning to claim a place in his own house. Telemachus then told the suitors that an assembly would meet at dawn. They should prepare to feast elsewhere, from their own stores, rather than continue consuming the inheritance of another family. Some laughed and asked which god had suddenly made him bold. Yet their mockery carried uncertainty, because courage is most disruptive when it appears in someone others have decided will remain passive. When evening deepened, the visitor Mentes stepped outside. Athena rose away in the form of a bird, and Telemachus understood that the council had come from more than an ordinary traveler. The old nurse Euryclea carried a lamp as Telemachus walked to his room. She had cared for him since infancy and sensed that the familiar corridors now contained a different kind of purpose. He lay beneath a woolen covering, but did not immediately sleep. In his thoughts, ships, roads, strangers, and the faces of returning soldiers formed the first outline of a world beyond Ithaca. At first light, heralds called the islanders together. The meeting place had not held a public assembly since Odysseus sailed for Troy, and weeds had grown between some of its stones. Telemachus carried his father's staff and sat in the place once used by the king. The seat seemed too large for him, yet taking it mattered more than appearing completely ready. An elder named Aegean spoke first. One of his sons had sailed with Odysseus and never returned. He welcomed the assembly because shared losses had remained unspoken for too long. Telemachus described the occupation of his home, the slaughter of livestock, and the pressure placed upon Penelope. His words were controlled, but anger trembled beneath their careful order. At the end, he threw the speaking staff down and wept. The gesture did not weaken the speech. It revealed how long he had been expected to carry an adult crisis alone. Antinous, the most aggressive suitor, shifted blame toward Penelope. She had delayed choosing a husband, he argued, and therefore the suitors were entitled to remain until her decision came. For years, Penelope had promised to choose after completing a burial shroud for Odysseus' father Laertes. Each day she wove, and each night she secretly undid part of the work. The plan had protected time, but a servant eventually revealed it. Antinous presented the story as deception. Others could hear in it the intelligence of a woman defending choices that force had narrowed. As the argument continued, two eagles swept over the gathering, wheeled together, and fought in the air before vanishing above the houses. The islanders lifted their faces to follow them. The elder Halitherses read the omen as a warning. Odysseus, he said, was near, and those abusing his household should end their behavior before consequence entered the harbor with him. The suitors mocked the interpretation and demanded that the meeting end. No public force rose to remove them, revealing how deeply habit and fear had weakened the island's willingness to act. Telemachus had not won the assembly, but he had spoken, listened, and learned who would help. He turned from the meeting ground toward the sea, where the next part of his answer waited. At the harbor, Telemachus washed his hands in the sea and asked Athena for help. The assembly had failed, and now the quiet work of departure had to begin without attracting the suitors' notice. Athena appeared again, this time resembling Mentor, an old friend of Odysseus. She promised to gather a crew and find a swift ship while Telemachus prepared food and wine. Telemachus returned to the palace and moved among the suitors without revealing the plan. Their laughter continued around him, but it no longer defined the limits of what he believed possible. He went to the locked storeroom where bronze, clothing, oil, grain, and jars of old wine had been kept under Euryclea's care since Odysseus sailed away. Telemachus asked the nurse to prepare barley meal and fill smaller jars with wine. When she understood that he meant to leave Ithaca, fear and affection crossed her face together. She begged him not to risk the sea, then accepted that he would go. Telemachus made her promise not to tell Penelope until 12 days had passed or the absence was discovered. A suitable vessel belonged to Noman, who lent it without knowing the full purpose. Athena selected 20 young rowers who could keep the preparation private until nightfall. After sunset, the crew carried meal, water, and wine aboard beneath folded cloaks. Each ordinary bundle moved the plan farther from thought and closer to a real voyage. Athena spread drowsiness through the palace. The suitors' voices softened, cups lowered, and heads leaned against cushions while Telemachus quietly stepped away from the hall. Mentor met him near the outer wall, and together they descended the dark path. Behind them, Penelope slept without knowing that her son was beginning a journey of his own. At the ship, Telemachus ordered the men to cast off. His voice sounded strange to him when it crossed the water, yet the crew responded as though he had always possessed it. Athena sent a steady wind from the west. The sail filled, the dark hull leaned forward, and Ithaca's familiar ridges slowly joined the larger darkness behind them. The crew poured a small offering into the sea, honoring the gods who guide travelers. Telemachus remained awake near the stern, listening to water separate and close behind the ship. By dawn, the island was gone from sight. Pale light revealed open water in every direction, and Telemachus felt the clean uncertainty of a horizon containing no familiar landmark. Later, the low coast of Pylos appeared. Smoke rose from the shore, where hundreds of people had gathered beside the sea for a great sacrifice to Poseidon. Telemachus hesitated when he saw the crowd. He had never approached renowned elders in a foreign land, and the courage needed for conversation seemed different from courage aboard a ship. Mentor told him that some words would arise from his own judgment and others would come with divine help. The advice was simple: walk forward before uncertainty invented another delay. Nestor's son Pisistratus saw the travelers and welcomed them before asking their names. He seated them near his father and offered portions from the shared ceremony. King Nestor was very old, with a voice shaped by councils, battles, and years of remembering. He accepted Telemachus's prayer and invited the strangers to eat before speaking. After the meal, Telemachus gave his name and asked directly for news of Odysseus. The The request silenced nearby conversation because Troy remained close in the memories of those who returned. Nestor remembered the long war, failed plans, divided councils, harsh winters, and companions buried far from home. Victory had not simplified anything, it merely released many separate journeys. Of Odysseus, Nestor recalled a mind quick enough to see several paths at once. In council, he could disagree strongly, yet he understood that strategy required listening before action. After Troy fell, disagreement divided the Greek leaders. Some sailed immediately, while others remained to make offerings. Odysseus first departed, then turned back, and Nestor lost track of him. Nestor described his own route across the Aegean, reading winds, honoring the gods, and refusing unnecessary delay. He reached Pylos safely, but heard only fragments about those behind him. He could not tell Telemachus whether Odysseus lived. The absence of news remained painful, but it was honest, and honest uncertainty was more useful than a comforting invention. Nestor then spoke of Orestes, who returned to punish the man who had destroyed his father Agamemnon's household. The comparison was meant to awaken responsibility, not demand imitation. The old king told Telemachus that courage would make his own name remembered. Yet beneath the praise lay a gentler lesson. A famous father cannot make a son's decisions for him. As darkness gathered, Mentor suggested returning to the ship. Nestor refused to let guests sleep on bare deck when beds and blankets waited inside his household. Mentor suddenly rose in the shape of a sea eagle and flew away over the harbor. Nestor watched in wonder and understood that Athena herself had accompanied the young traveler. The old king raised his hands and asked Athena to favor his household as she had favored Odysseus. A journey that began in secrecy had now received public recognition. Pisistratus led Telemachus to a covered bed in the portico. For the first time, he slept beneath another household's roof, listening to unfamiliar footsteps settle into silence. At dawn, Nestor's family prepared an offering to Athena. Water was carried, wood arranged, and every task found its proper place within the household's practiced rhythm. A craftsman covered the horns of the chosen heifer with thin gold, making the offering beautiful. The scene joined skilled hands, family duty, and reverence without separating ordinary work from sacred purpose. Nestor, his sons, and daughters gathered as the rite proceeded. Telemachus participated as a guest, learning that belonging can begin temporarily through the customs of a welcoming house. Nestor believed Menelaus might know more, because he had wandered widely before reaching Sparta. He ordered a chariot prepared and chose Pisistratus to guide Telemachus overland. Before departure, attendants washed the salt and travel dust from Telemachus and gave him a clean cloak. He emerged looking more like an honored envoy than a hidden passenger. His crew would remain at Pylos with the vessel. Telemachus looked once toward the mast that had carried him from Ithaca, then climbed into the waiting chariot. Pisistratus shook the reins, and the horses moved east across the plain. Fields, low hills, and farmsteads replaced the sea, widening Telemachus's sense of the world in another direction. They stopped at Pherae, where another household received them for the night. The road was proving that hospitality formed a chain of safe places across an uncertain landscape. At dawn, they continued toward Sparta. Mountains gathered along the horizon, and Telemachus carried Nestor's memories with him, still without an answer but no longer without direction. After another day on the road, Telemachus and Pisistratus entered the broad valley of Sparta. Mountains enclosed fertile fields, and the palace at Menelaus shone with preparations for a celebration. Inside, Menelaus was celebrating marriages for his son and daughter. Music, food, horses, and arriving families filled the courts, yet the king ordered that the unknown travelers be welcomed immediately. Telemachus looked at bronze, gold, amber, carved wood, and polished surfaces gathered through Menelaus's travels. The abundance seemed almost divine compared with the troubled halls of Ithaca. Menelaus heard his wonder and answered without pride. He would surrender much of the treasure, he said, if doing so could restore the companions who never returned from Troy. As the meal continued, Menelaus studied Telemachus. The shape of his hands, eyes, and brow recalled Odysseus so strongly that the king began to suspect the traveler's identity. Helen entered the hall and saw the same resemblance at once. Her life had become inseparable from the causes and stories of Troy, and she recognized the son of its cleverest Greek commander. Telemachus confirmed his name. Speaking openly of Odysseus brought tears to the young man. Menelaus, Helen, and Pisistratus, whose own brother had also died far from home. Pisistratus reminded them that grief should be honored without consuming the entire evening. His measured words pleased Menelaus, who recognized in him the thoughtful training of Nestor's household. Helen mixed a soothing Egyptian herb into the wine, easing the sharpest edge of sorrow. The old poem describes its power generously. Here it marks a household making room for difficult memory. Helen told how Odysseus once entered Troy disguised as a beaten servant. Dirt and rough clothing concealed him, but his alert gaze revealed a mind carefully recording every gate and passage. She recognized him, bathed him, and swore not to expose the plan. Odysseus then returned to the Greek camp carrying knowledge that would help bring the long siege toward its end. Menelaus remembered a later night inside the wooden horse where chosen warriors waited in darkness. Outside, Helen circled the structure and imitated the voices of their wives. Some men nearly answered, overcome by longing. Odysseus covered their mouths and held everyone still until the danger passed, preserving the plan through restraint rather than strength. When the stories ended, servants prepared beds beneath the portico. Telemachus lay awake briefly, now surrounded by people who had truly known his father rather than merely repeated his fame. At dawn, Menelaus sat beside Telemachus and asked why he had come. The young man described the suitors and requested any trustworthy knowledge of Odysseus's fate. The king compared the suitors to weak animals entering a lion's resting place. His anger was for the violation of hospitality and for the absent friend whose household had been treated as ownerless. Menelaus explained that his own homecoming lasted years. Contrary winds carried him through Cyprus, Phoenicia, Egypt, and distant coasts before he found the knowledge needed to sail home. On the island of Pharos near Egypt, his ships remained trapped by calm weather. Supplies diminished, and the crews searched the shore each day while the sails hung without movement. A sea goddess named Ithaca took pity on Menelaus. She told him that her father Proteus knew the hidden paths of the sea and could reveal what blocked the voyage. Proteus rested among seals at midday. Ithaca concealed Menelaus and 3 companions beneath heavy seal skins and gave them fragrant balm to endure the difficult hiding place. When Proteus lay down, the men seized him. He changed through many shapes: lion, serpent, leopard, boar, flowing water, and finally a tree, testing whether they would release him. At last the transformations ended, and Proteus resumed the form of an old man. He asked what knowledge could be worth such patience, and Menelaus asked how to leave Egypt. The answer was ritual rather than navigation. Menelaus had departed without completing the proper offerings. He returned up the Nile, honored the gods, and favorable winds finally arrived. Proteus also described the homecomings of other Greeks. Ajax survived the sea, then boasted against the gods, and was lost when Poseidon broke the rock where he had taken refuge. Agamemnon reached home only to enter a deadly betrayal within his own household. Menelaus told the story briefly because its darkness belonged to another family's long chain of consequence. Then came the answer Telemachus had crossed the sea to find. Proteus had seen Odysseus alive on the island of Ogygia, held there by the nymph Calypso without a ship or crew. The news did not bring immediate relief. Life on a distant island was not the same as a route home, yet it replaced the shapeless possibility of death with a living person who might still return. Menelaus offered horses and a chariot, but Telemachus explained that rocky Ithaca had little land for horses. The king admired an answer shaped by the real needs of home. Instead, Menelaus gave him a silver mixing bowl made by skilled hands and carried through earlier journeys. A useful object now became a link between households and generations. The travelers remained for one more meal. Helen prepared clothing, Menelaus arranged provisions, and the palace celebration continued around a quieter farewell shaped by news finally found. As the chariot departed, an eagle carried a goose from the palace yard. Helen read the omen as a sign that Odysseus would return and seize control of his house. Telemachus and Pisistratus turned west across the plain. The route was familiar now, but the traveler had changed, carrying certain news where only questions had traveled before. Back on Ithaca, Naman casually asked the suitors when Telemachus would return his ship. His question revealed that the young man had left with a crew and mentor at his side. Antinous had assumed Telemachus lacked the courage to leave. Surprise quickly became calculation, because a successful journey might bring allies, confidence, and news that weakened the suitors' position. They selected a fast vessel and planned to wait in the channel between Ithaca and Same. Their purpose was to prevent Telemachus from returning to challenge them. The herald Medon overheard the plan and told Penelope. Until that moment, she had known neither that her son had sailed, nor that danger now waited for him offshore. Her strength gave way briefly. Odysseus was absent, and now the son who carried the household's future had entered the same uncertain sea without saying farewell. Eurycleia admitted that she had helped prepare the provisions and promised secrecy. Penelope first blamed the nurse, then understood that Telemachus had left because remaining passive had become another danger. That night, Athena sent a comforting dream shaped like Penelope's sister Iphthime. The figure promised that Telemachus remained under divine protection, though it gave no answer about Odysseus. While Telemachus traveled toward Pylos with news of his father, The suitors waited at sea to stop him. 2 courses moved through darkness, each approaching Ithaca for a different purpose. Far from Ithaca and the traveled harbors, Ogygia rose green from the sea. Vines, cedar, alder, springs, and flowering meadows surrounded a cave hidden beyond ordinary sailing routes. Calypso lived there in comfort untouched by time. A fire scented the cave with cedar smoke while she moved at her loom and sang to the quiet island. Odysseus did not share the island's contentment. Each day he sat on the western rocks, looking across water that contained no visible road to Ithaca, and grief became part of the tide. 7 years had passed on Ogygia after the loss of his last ship. Calypso offered safety, beauty, and companionship, but safety without choice had slowly become another kind of confinement. While Poseidon remained away, Athena again brought Odysseus' suffering before Zeus. The time had come, the gods agreed, for Calypso to release the wanderer and let consequence resume its course. Hermes fastened his sandals, took the wand of a messenger, and descended from the bright air. He traveled over the sea like a bird skimming close above the waves. Calypso recognized the god and welcomed him with food and drink. Divine visitors were rare even on a beautiful island, and she asked what command had carried him so far. Hermes delivered Zeus's decision. Odysseus must leave. No god would escort him, but he could build a raft and trust the sea to carry him toward the Phaeacians. Calypso protested the unequal rules applied to goddesses who loved mortal men. Her anger was genuine, yet she knew that resisting Zeus would only add force to an already painful separation. She agreed to help and swore that no hidden plan would destroy Odysseus at sea. She would provide tools, cloth, food, water, wine, and knowledge of the guiding stars. Calypso found Odysseus in his familiar place beside the waves. She told him that he could leave, but freedom after years of waiting sounded almost too sudden to trust. Odysseus asked her to swear that the raft was not a trap. Survival had trained him to question gifts, especially when the proposed vessel seemed small against the distance ahead. Calypso reminded him that he could remain and never grow old. Penelope was mortal, while life on Ogygia might continue without age, illness, or the uncertainty of home. Odysseus answered carefully. He knew Penelope was mortal and that suffering waited beyond the island, yet he still chose the finite life that contained his own household and history. The next morning, Calypso led him to tall trees suitable for a raft. Odysseus selected trunks, studying their grain and balance as though rebuilding the habits of purposeful work. He cut the trees with the bronze axe, trimmed their branches, and shaped the lengths with an adze. Each measured stroke turned the impossible idea of departure into a physical object. 20 timbers were laid side by side, bored, joined, and fastened. Cross pieces strengthened the platform, while a raised edge offered some protection from the open sea. Odysseus fitted a mast, yard, sail, and steering oar. The craft was not a ship, but it carried the knowledge of someone who had watched sailors solve problems for many years. Calypso brought strong cloth for the sail, and warm clothing for the traveler. She packed bread, water, wine, and food meant to endure days beneath sun and salt. She told him to keep the Great Bear on his left and watch the familiar constellations through the night. The sky would become the map that no wave could wash away. On the 5th morning of work, Odysseus pushed away. Calypso stood on the shore until distance reduced her to a small figure among the trees and bright water. For 17 days, the weather held. Odysseus slept in brief intervals, adjusted the sail, rationed water, and kept the stars in their proper places around him. On the 18th day, the shadowed mountains of Scheria appeared like a shield laid across the horizon. Land had become visible, but safety had not yet reached him. Poseidon came back from his distant journey and saw Odysseus nearing shore. The sea god had not forgiven the blinding of his son Polyphemus, and calm water darkened beneath his anger. Clouds closed over the sky. Winds struck from every direction, waves rose, and the raft disappeared between walls of water before climbing into view again. Odysseus wished briefly that he had died at Troy, where companions could have witnessed and honored his end. The lonely sea offered no audience, grave, or story. A great wave struck and threw him into the water. The steering oar vanished, timber separated, and the supplies Calypso had packed scattered into the storm. He surfaced, found the raft, and pulled himself across the remaining logs. The structure had become little more than a floating platform, but for the moment it still separated him from the depths. The sea goddess Ino rose in the shape of a bird and offered a protective veil. She told him to abandon the raft, swim, and return the veil once he reached land. Odysseus hesitated again, unsure whether the advice concealed danger. He decided to remain with the timbers until the sea itself removed the choice, balancing trust against experience. Poseidon sent one last wave that shattered what remained. Odysseus tied Ino's veil around his chest, entered the water, and began the long swim toward Scheria. Athena quieted every wind except the north wind that pushed him toward land. 2 days and nights passed while he swam, floated, and protected his remaining strength. At last, he heard surf-striking cliffs. The nearest coast offered no beach, only sharp rock and waves that could lift a swimmer and throw him against stone. A wave carried him forward, and Odysseus caught the rock with both hands. The retreating water tore at him, but he held until another wave pulled him free. He noticed a river entering the sea where the water was smoother and the shore lower. Odysseus prayed to the river and felt the current ease enough to let him pass. On the bank, he removed Ino's veil and cast it downstream. The cloth floated back toward the sea, returning divine help once its purpose had been fulfilled. Salt covered his skin, his body shook with cold, and every breath seemed borrowed. He crawled beyond the wet stones, knowing that open ground would leave him exposed through the night. He found 2 dense olive bushes growing together, one wild and one cultivated. Their woven branches blocked the wind and held a deep bed of fallen leaves. Odysseus covered himself until only his face remained visible. After years on a perfect island and days on a broken raft, the simplest shelter became enough. Athena closed his eyes in a deep restoring sleep. Beyond the bushes, Scheria settled into darkness, unaware that a famous stranger had reached its shore without ship, crew, or name. While Odysseus slept beneath the olive leaves, Athena entered the palace of Scheria in a dream. She appeared to Princess Nausicaa as a trusted friend and spoke about clothing, marriage, and the duties of a household preparing for change. Nausicaa woke before sunrise and asked her father Alcinous for a wagon. She carefully mentioned the family's laundry rather than the marriage implied by her dream, preserving the privacy of thoughts not yet ready for public conversation. Alcinous understood more than she said, but asked no embarrassing questions. Servants loaded clothing, her mother packed food and oil, and mules carried Nausicaa and her companions toward the river beyond the city walls. Where the river widened into clear pools, the women washed the clothing, pressed it clean, and spread bright woven pieces across warm stones and low bushes. Ordinary work filled the quiet place with color. When the work was finished, they bathed, shared the food Queen Arete had packed, and waited for sunlight to dry the cloth. Beyond the reeds, Odysseus remained hidden beneath his deep sleep. The companions began a ball game on the open bank. Athena guided one throw beyond its target and into deep water, where the splash surprised the players and brought a chorus of cries. The voices woke Odysseus. For a moment, he wondered whether the island held violent people or welcoming ones. He covered himself with a leafy branch and stepped cautiously from the shelter. Salt, leaves, and exhaustion made him appear frightening, and most of the women fled along the bank. Nausicaa remained, steadied by Athena and by a courage that did not require pretending the stranger looked harmless. Odysseus considered grasping her knees in formal supplication, then understood that approaching too closely could increase her fear. He remained at a distance and trusted carefully chosen words instead. He compared Nausicaa to a young palm he once saw beside Apollo's altar on Delos, graceful, uncommon, and surrounded by wonder. The compliment honored her without claiming familiarity. Odysseus asked for clothing and directions, revealing only that the sea had destroyed his raft. He wished her a good household and the harmony of 2 people able to understand one another. She explained that the Phaeacians did not ignore strangers sent by hardship. Food, clothing, and guidance would be given because fortune changes and no household remains beyond the reach of need. Odysseus bathed farther upstream, away from the women, rubbing salt from his skin and oil into weathered shoulders. Athena restored his appearance, making health and confidence visible again. When he returned dressed in clean cloth, the companions saw a different figure from the one who emerged among the leaves. Nausicaa quietly recognized the possibility of nobility beneath disaster. Nausicaa worried that entering the city beside an unknown man would invite careless gossip. She asked Odysseus to follow later and wait in Athena's grove until the wagon reached the palace. Inside the palace, he should appeal first to Queen Arete. Her judgment guided the household, and if she received him kindly, his hope of returning home would become much stronger. Odysseus waited among poplars near a spring and prayed to Athena. When enough time had passed, he followed the road toward Scheria's city, carrying no possession except borrowed clothing and experience. The city was shaped by ships. Long quays held dark holes, workshops opened toward the water, and sailors moved through streets where knowledge of currents and rigging belonged to ordinary life. Athena wrapped Odysseus in mist so no one would interrupt him before he reached the palace. Disguised as a young local girl, she appeared long enough to guide him through the streets. The palace doors opened onto a hall bright with bronze, carved timber, woven scenes, and fires that reflected across polished surfaces. Orchards and gardens beyond the court seemed to remain fruitful through every season. The mist cleared beside the hearth. Odysseus placed himself before Arete, asked for help reaching home, and then sat humbly in the ashes while the gathered nobles remained silent. An elder named Echeneus reminded Alcinous that leaving a guest in the ashes dishonored the house. The king raised Odysseus, offered his own son's seat, and ordered food and wine. Alcinous promised that Phaeacian sailors would carry the stranger wherever home might be. Their ships knew the sea almost instinctively, crossing great distances without confusion or fear. Arete recognized the cloak woven by her own household and asked how the stranger had obtained it. Odysseus told the truth about Ogygia, the raft, the storm, and Nausicaa, his kindness. Alcinous wondered why his daughter had not brought the stranger directly. Odysseus protected Nausicaa from blame, saying that he himself chose to enter separately out of caution and respect. Servants prepared a bed beneath the portico, and Odysseus slept inside a protected household for the first time in many years. The sea remained close, but for one night it required nothing from him. At dawn, Alcinous called the Phaeacian leaders together. He announced that an unknown traveler needed passage and ordered a ship, 52 rowers, a feast, and public games. The blind singer Demodocus entered with a lyre and the trusted guide. His first song described an argument between Odysseus and Achilles during the war at Troy. Odysseus covered his face with the borrowed cloak and wept whenever the song returned to Troy. Alcinous noticed, though the other guests continued listening without understanding the stranger's grief. To change the mood, the Phaeacians moved outside for running, wrestling, jumping, boxing, and throwing the discus. Their skill reflected a peaceful people who trained strength without living for war. A young athlete named Euryalus mocked Odysseus as a merchant rather than a competitor. The insult touched the traveler's pride, especially after years in which his name and abilities had been stripped away. Odysseus lifted a heavier discus and sent it beyond every previous mark. Athena, again disguised among the crowd, indicated the landing place and confirmed the throw's extraordinary distance. Alcinous ended the tension and asked his dancers to demonstrate Phaeacian grace. Euryalus later apologized and gave Odysseus a bronze sword with a silver hilt and carved sheath. Two sons at Alcinous danced while tossing a bright ball between them, never breaking rhythm. The display replaced challenge with coordination, and Odysseus praised their remarkable control. Each Phaeacian leader contributed clothing and worked metal for the guests' return. Arete packed the gifts in a chest and tied it securely so nothing would be scattered during the voyage. Nausicaa met Odysseus near a palace column and asked him to remember the person who helped preserve his life. He promised that, at home, gratitude would keep her name present. At the evening feast, Odysseus asked Demodocus to sing about the wooden horse and the fall of Troy. The poet described the hidden warriors, the opened gates, and the city changing in a single night. Again, Odysseus wept beneath his cloak. This time, Alcinous stopped the song, because a good host must notice when entertainment becomes suffering for someone seated within the house. The king asked the stranger to reveal his name, homeland, and the reason Troy stories caused such pain. A ship could find any coast, but first its sailors needed to know whom they carried. The traveler finally answered he was Odysseus, son of Laertes, from rocky Ithaca. With his name restored before a listening household, he began the long account of how the sea had kept him. Before the listening Phaeacians, Odysseus carried his story backwards to the morning after Troy fell. 12 ships moved away from the smoking coast, filled with survivors who believed the hardest part of their journey had ended. The fleet first reached Ismarus, home of the Cyclops. Odysseus's men attacked the coastal settlement and took supplies, continuing the habits of war after the war itself had supposedly finished. Odysseus ordered an immediate departure, but many companions remained to feast on the shore. Delay gave the Cyclops time to summon allies from the interior, and the balance of numbers changed. Fighting returned with the dawn. The Greeks escaped to their ships, but each vessel left empty places among its rowing benches. The first homeward stop had already shown how victory could carry dangerous habits forward. A northern storm struck as the fleet rounded Cape Malea. Wind tore at the sails, rain erased the coast, and the ships were forced far south of the familiar route toward Ithaca. For 9 days, wind and current carried them across uncertain water. The men rowed when they could, rested when they must, and watched every sunrise reveal another horizon without a known landmark. At last, they landed in a gentle country where people offered the fruit of the lotus. Odysseus sent 3 men inland to learn who lived there and whether water and food were available. The lotus did not injure the visitors. Instead, it softened their desire to return until ship, household, and obligation seemed like distant stories belonging to someone else. Odysseus found them unwilling to leave and carried them weeping to the ships. He ordered the crew to depart quickly, afraid that comfort could dissolve purpose more completely than a storm. The fleet next reached an uninhabited island rich with wild goats. Across a narrow channel lay a larger land where smoke rose from caves and enormous shepherds tended separate flocks. The crews hunted goats, shared wine, and rested beside their ships. From the opposite shore came the sounds of sheep and deep voices, suggesting inhabitants unlike any people they had met. Curiosity led Odysseus to take his own ship across the channel with 12 companions. He brought a skin of unusually strong wine received from Maron, a priest spared at Ismarus. The wine was so concentrated that a small amount flavored a large bowl of water. Odysseus carried it because unknown hosts might welcome a valuable gift, though its purpose would become very different. Beyond the shore, the travelers found a vast cave enclosed by stone walls and tall trees. Pens held lambs and kids separated by age, revealing a shepherd's careful routine despite the place's enormous scale. Inside were baskets of cheese, pails of whey, and vessels for milking. The companions urged Odysseus to take food and leave, but he wanted to meet the owner and receive a guest gift. At evening, Polyphemus drove his flock into the cave. He was a solitary Cyclops of immense size, with one great eye and a manner shaped by living beyond assemblies, laws, or neighbors. He lifted a boulder across the cave mouth, a stone far beyond the strength of the trapped sailors. Then he sat to milk the animals and prepare the evening cheese. When the fire brightened, the Cyclops noticed the strangers. His voice filled the cave as he demanded their names, their ship, and whether they traveled as merchants or raiders. Odysseus appealed to hospitality and to Zeus, protector of strangers. Polyphemus answered that Cyclops did not fear Zeus, and strength mattered more to him than customs shared by smaller people. Asked about the ship, Odysseus claimed that Poseidon had broken it against the rocks. The lie protected the vessel and the companions who waited beside the hidden cove. Polyphemus seized members of the crew and killed them with terrible ease. We leave the violence outside the image. What matters is that the cave had become a prison ruled without mercy. Odysseus considered using his sword while the Cyclops slept, then saw the boulder at the entrance. Killing their captor would leave every survivor sealed inside the cave. At dawn, Polyphemus milked his animals and rolled the stone aside. He released the flock, then replaced the barrier, never suspecting that the sheep themselves might provide a route out. The prisoners found a long piece of olive wood meant for a shepherd's staff. They cut, smoothed, and hardened its point in the fire, then hid it beneath refuse inside the cave. Odysseus chose 4 companions by lot to help lift the heavy pole when the moment came. The task required shared timing because no single man could control the object alone. When Polyphemus returned, Odysseus offered Maron's wine. The Cyclops drank, marveled at its strength, and asked for more, believing the stranger had finally become useful. Asked for his name, Odysseus answered, "Nobody." Polyphemus promised that nobody would receive the final guest gift, a cruel joke that unknowingly prepared the Cyclops' own confusion. The strong wine overcame the giant, who fell into heavy sleep beside the dying fire. The companions uncovered the olive pole and heated its point among the coals. Together they drove the pole into the Cyclops' eye and turned it until his sight was destroyed. The act is told without lingering on pain. It opened the only possible path toward escape. Polyphemus roared, and neighboring Cyclopes called from outside to ask who harmed him. He answered that nobody was attacking him, so they assumed his suffering came from illness or divine trouble. At dawn, the blinded Cyclops moved the boulder and sat across the opening. He felt the back of every sheep that passed, certain the men could not escape beneath the animals. Odysseus tied the largest rams in groups of 3 with willow cords. Beneath each middle animal, a sailor clung silently, concealed by the thick wool on either side. Odysseus held beneath the strongest ram without companions on either side. The animal moved last, carrying both the leader and the weight of Polyphemus's affection. Polyphemus stopped the ram and wondered why it walked so slowly. He spoke tenderly to the animal about his lost sight, never realizing that Odysseus listened beneath its body. Once clear of the enclosure, the sailors released themselves, gathered sheep, and hurried toward the ship. The companions waiting there received them with relief shadowed by the empty places among them. Rowers drove the ship across the water. When they had reached what seemed a safe distance, Odysseus called back toward the shore, unable to leave without claiming the victory as his own. Polyphemus followed the voice and threw a great stone. It struck the sea ahead of the bow, and the returning wave nearly carried the ship back onto the shore. Companions begged for silence, but Odysseus shouted his true name, his father, and his island. The announcement transformed a successful escape into a personal challenge heard by someone with divine connections. Polyphemus raised his hands to Poseidon and asked that Odysseus return late, alone, and under sorrow. The sea god heard the prayer of his son, and the voyage acquired a deeper resistance. The ship reached the Goat Island, where the remaining crews waited. They divided the flock and mourned the lost companions while smoke from the Cyclops' shore faded into evening haze. From the Goat Island, the fleet sailed to Aeolia, a steep-walled island said to float upon the sea. Bronze ramparts circled its heights, and the household of Aeolus lived within a continuous feast. Aeolus understood the paths of every wind. He welcomed Odysseus for a month, listening closely to the history of Troy and the first difficult stages of the homeward voyage. 6 sons and 6 daughters shared the island household, eating together beneath a roof protected from ordinary weather. Their enclosed prosperity contrasted with the restless ships waiting below. When departure came, Aeolus placed every dangerous wind inside a strong oxhide bag and tied it with shining cord. Only the west wind remained free to carry the fleet toward Ithaca. For 9 days and nights, Odysseus held the steering oar and refused sleep. The fleet crossed calm water so steadily that Ithaca's watchfires finally appeared along the dark horizon. Exhaustion overcame him within sight of home. Odysseus lay down, trusting the crew to follow the wind for a few more hours, while the mysterious bag rested beside him. The sailors believed Aeolus had filled the bag with gold and silver meant only for their captain. Long hardship made imagined unfairness easier to trust than the explanation they had been given. They loosened the shining cord. Every captive wind burst outward, striking sail and sea at once, and the fleet spun away from Ithaca beneath a sky suddenly filled with storm. The storm carried them all the way to Aeolia. Odysseus approached the palace again and asked for help, ashamed to explain that his own crew had undone the gift. Aeolus concluded that anyone opposed so strongly by the gods could not be helped safely. He ordered the fleet away, and the island gates closed against a second chance. Without a favorable wind, the crews rowed for 6 days. Oars entered and left the water in exhausted rhythm until they reached a harbor surrounded by steep stone walls. 11 captains brought their ships inside and tied them close together beneath the cliffs. Odysseus alone kept his vessel outside the entrance, secured to a rock in open water. 3 scouts followed a road inland, where wagon tracks led toward a city. The strange light seemed to blur the usual boundary between evening and morning. At a spring, they met a young woman of extraordinary height, daughter of the Laestrygonian king Antiphates. She directed them toward her parents' house without warning what waited there. Inside the house, the scouts saw a woman as large as a mountain and fled in fear. She called her husband, and the city's response changed immediately from curiosity to pursuit. Laestrygonians gathered along the cliffs and threw stones into the crowded harbor. Ships penned close together had no space to turn, and the protected anchorage became the fleet's destruction. Because Odysseus had remained beyond the entrance, his ship still faced open sea. He cut the mooring rope, ordered every oar into the water, and escaped with the survivors aboard. The sea soon became quiet again, but 11 ships were gone. The men remaining with Odysseus now carried the knowledge that every later decision would concern the last vessel of the fleet. They reached Aeaea, an island covered by dense forest. After 2 days of grief and exhaustion beside the ship, Odysseus climbed a hill to search for smoke or signs of habitation. From the height he saw a thin column of smoke rising near the forest center. He returned with a hunted stag, and the crew shared food before deciding who would investigate. Lots divided the survivors into 2 groups. Odysseus led one, while Eurylochus led the other toward the smoke with 22 men, following a path beneath enormous trees. Near a timber and stone house, lions and wolves moved calmly around the visitors, wagging like familiar dogs. Their gentleness was more unsettling than aggression would have been. Inside, Circe sang while working at a great loom. Her voice carried through the clearing, and the travelers called at the door, eager to replace fear with the welcome of a household. Circe invited them inside and mixed cheese, barley, honey, wine, and a hidden drug. Eurylochus remained outside, suspicious of a welcome that arrived without questions. When the men had eaten, Circe touched them with her wand and changed their bodies into swine while their human understanding remained. She led them into clean pens and gave them acorns. Eurylochus waited until certainty replaced suspicion, then hurried back through the forest. At the ship, his voice failed at first, and tears communicated the danger before words returned. Odysseus took his sword and bow and started toward Circe's house. Eurylochus begged him not to go, convinced that anyone entering the clearing would never return unchanged. A young man appeared beneath the trees and revealed himself as Hermes. He explained Circe's drug and showed Odysseus a protective plant known to the gods as moly. The plant had a dark root and a pale flower, beautiful but difficult for mortals to pull from the ground. With it, Odysseus could drink safely and remain himself. Circe welcomed Odysseus and prepared the same mixture. He drank, felt the hidden power pass without changing him, and waited as she raised the wand. When the spell failed, Odysseus drew his sword but did not strike. Circe recognized him from prophecy and agreed to swear that no further harm or deception would follow. Circe anointed the animals with another preparation. The companions regained their human forms, appearing younger and healthier, and their relief filled the hall with tears and embraces. Odysseus returned to the beach and led the remaining crew inland. Eurylochus resisted until the others insisted, and soon every survivor entered Circe's house together. Attendants heated water, washed salt from the travelers, and supplied clean clothing. Food appeared in abundance, yet grief for the lost ships prevented the men from enjoying it at first. Circe told them to eat and recover until strength returned to their bodies and fear loosened its hold. Rest, she understood, was not forgetfulness when chosen for healing rather than escape. Days became months as the crew remained on Aegean. The island offered food, shelter, and safety, and the urgency of home slowly softened beneath a life without immediate danger. After a year, the men approached Odysseus and reminded him that rest had become delay. Ithaca still existed beyond the forest, and every peaceful day also increased the length of absence. Odysseus asked Circe to honor her promise of departure. She agreed at once, but explained that their route must first lead beyond the normal sea to seek counsel from the dead. Only the prophet Tiresias could explain the dangers ahead and the conditions of a true homecoming. Death had not removed his understanding, and the travelers would need to reach him below the world. The crew stood silent before this instruction. Home now required a road through the land of shades, and the safe forest around them seemed brighter because they were preparing to leave it. During the final night on Aegean, a young sailor named Elpenor slept apart on the roof. Startled awake at dawn, he forgot the ladder, fell to the ground, and died before anyone understood what had happened. The crew gathered at the ship without noticing his absence. Their attention had turned toward the impossible voyage ahead, and one companion was left behind by accident rather than intention. Circe described the route to Ocean's edge, where dark rivers met beside a rock. There Odysseus must dig a trench, pour offerings, and keep the shades away until Tiresias had spoken. She sent a favorable wind that filled the sail and carried the ship westward. The crew spoke little as the familiar blue water gradually darkened beneath a sky without warmth. They reached a coast where mist hid the sun and the people lived beneath continuous cloud. The setting was not punishment, it was a boundary where ordinary daylight no longer organized time. Odysseus followed Circe's directions to the place where several underworld rivers met near a dark rock. The names suggested sorrow, fire, lamentation, and the unbreakable limits of death. With his sword, Odysseus dug a narrow trench. He poured milk with honey, wine, water, and barley, then promised the dead proper offerings when he eventually reached Ithaca. The shades approached like distant memories taking form, old people, young warriors, women, children, and workers whose lives had ended in different places. Their many voices moved around the trench like leaves. Odysseus held his sword across the offering and prevented every shade from drinking until Tiresias arrived. Even here, patience and sequence mattered. Grief could not be allowed to overturn the purpose. The first familiar face was Elpenor, whose body still lay unburied on Aegean. Odysseus was shocked to meet someone who had stood alive within the household only hours before. Elpenor asked the crew to return, burn his body, raise a marker, and place his oar upon it. He wanted an ordinary sign that a traveler had existed and belonged to companions. Odysseus promised that the rites would be completed. The shade withdrew, and the journey acquired its first obligation for the return path, a duty owed before they could sail onward. Then Odysseus saw his mother Anticlea among the shades. She had been alive when he left for Troy, and he had not known that absence and grief had carried her away. Even in death, Tiresias carried a golden staff and moved with clear purpose. The other shades made way as the blind prophet came forward to receive the offering and speak. Tiresias explained that Poseidon opposed the voyage because Polyphemus had been blinded. Home remained possible, but only if Odysseus and his crew controlled their desires on the island of the sun. On Nausicaa, sacred cattle would graze under the protection of Helios. If the men left them untouched, they might all return. If not, the ship and crew would be lost. Tiresias foresaw Odysseus reaching Ithaca late and alone, finding men consuming his household. He would restore order, then travel inland carrying an oar until its meaning was unknown. At that distant place, Odysseus would make peace with Poseidon. Only afterward could he return to Ithaca and reach an old age surrounded by a people no longer divided. His counsel complete, Tiresias stepped back into the mist. He had not promised an easy route, only a route whose dangers could be recognized before they arrived. Odysseus then allowed Anticlea to approach the offering. Recognition entered her face, and mother and son spoke across a distance that no ship or clever plan could close. She told him that Penelope remained faithful, Telemachus guarded the diminished estate, and Laertes lived quietly in the countryside. The household endured, though every member carried absence differently. Anticlea had not died from illness or violence. Longing for her absent son slowly exhausted her desire to remain, a loss created not by one moment but by years without an ending. Odysseus reached for his mother 3 times, and 3 times his arms passed through her shade. The repeated gesture taught what words could not. Memory resembles presence without becoming physical presence. Anticlea explained that after death, the body no longer holds spirit and bone together. The shade moves like a dream, keeping voice and recognition while surrendering weight. Other shades came forward and named families, cities, loves, and sorrows from generations before Troy. Their brief accounts widened the poem beyond one voyage into many connected histories. Agamemnon approached and described the betrayal that ended his homecoming. His bitterness led him to distrust, but he praised Penelope when Odysseus spoke of her patience and judgment. Achilles arrived with companions from Troy. Odysseus tried to comfort him with the honor surrounding his name, but Achilles valued one ordinary day of life above authority among shades. Odysseus then described the courage of Achilles' son Neoptolemus at Troy. The shade departed with a lighter step, pleased that his child had earned a story independent of his father's. Ajax remained angry because Odysseus had received the armor of Achilles after their friend's death. Odysseus called to him with regret, but the shade turned away without answering. Farther on, King Minos sat with a scepter while shades brought disputes before him. Even in the underworld, people imagined that disagreements required listening, order, and judgment. The giant hunter Orion crossed a shadowed meadow where the animals he once pursued moved around him. The old activities of life persisted there as echoes rather than necessities. Tantalus stood in water beneath fruit he could never reach. Whenever he bent to drink or raised his hand, water and branches withdrew, turning abundance into permanent distance. Sisyphus pushed a stone toward a hilltop only to watch it roll back before completion. The image transformed effort without purpose into one of the poem's clearest warnings. A shadow of Heracles appeared with a bow, while the hero himself was said to dwell among the gods. His divided presence suggested how fame, memory, and person can follow different paths. More shades gathered, and Odysseus feared that the underworld might reveal something too powerful to endure. He called the companions back and ended the ritual before curiosity became another form of pride. The crew returned quickly to the dark shore, raised the mast, and pushed into ocean's current. Behind them, the mist closed over the meeting place as though no living ship had arrived. As the ship moved east, gray water gradually became blue and warmth returned to the sky. The ordinary sun felt newly remarkable after a place where light never changed. On Aegean, they found Elpenor and completed every promised rite. His ashes were buried beneath a mound, and his oar was placed upright so passing travelers might understand who rested there. Circe came from the forest with food and wine. She praised the crew for crossing the boundary twice in one journey, then asked them to rest before hearing the next warnings. The men ate beside the water as evening settled around Aegean. They had received the knowledge they sought, but ahead waited temptations and dangers that knowledge alone could not remove. At dawn, Circe spread the next part of the voyage before Odysseus. Every safe harbor had disappeared from the route. The ship must now pass dangers that could be managed only through restraint and preparation. First came the Sirens, whose song promised knowledge of every event at Troy and across the earth. Sailors who followed that promise forgot their homes and allowed their ships to drift away. Circe told Odysseus to soften beeswax and seal the ears of every companion. They would row past without hearing a single note, protected by a humble material and a carefully followed plan. Odysseus could listen only if he was tied upright to the mast. However urgently he begged, the crew must tighten the ropes rather than release him until the island had vanished behind them. Beyond the Sirens, Circe described 2 possible passages. One led beneath wandering rocks that crushed ships. The other ran between Scylla's high cave and the whirlpool of Charybdis. No plan could make the second passage harmless. Circe advised sailing close to Scylla, accepting a smaller danger rather than allowing Charybdis to swallow the entire vessel at once. Last stood Thrinacia, where the cattle and sheep of Helios grazed without aging or multiplying. Circe repeated Tiresias's warning, touch nothing there, however hungry the crew became. The crew launched at first light. Circe sent another following wind, and her island diminished into a green line while the sailors prepared wax, ropes, and courage for the narrowing sea. As the air grew still, Odysseus cut the wax into pieces and warmed them between his hands. One by one, he pressed the softened plug securely into his companion's ears. The sailors tied their captain firmly to the mast, leaving his ears uncovered. He tested the knots, nodded to begin, and the oars entered water that had become strangely smooth. Near the island, the helpful wind disappeared and the sail hung loose. The sea seemed to hold its breath, so the crew lowered the sail and rowed into the unnatural quiet. Only Odysseus heard the sirens begin. Their voices sounded intimate rather than loud, as if they knew the unanswered question hidden within every memory he carried from Troy. They promised to tell him everything: the suffering of Greeks and Trojans, the movements of distant peoples, and the shape of a world no traveler could witness alone. Odysseus signaled urgently for release, forgetting his own instructions beneath the force of the song. The ropes held, and his companions saw only a man struggling against a choice already made. Perimedes and Eurylochus rose without hearing his pleas and added another turn around the mast. Their obedience protected the captain precisely because, for those few moments, they refused to obey him. The island passed astern, and the voices thinned into ordinary wind. When the crew removed their wax, Odysseus was quiet, carrying knowledge not from the song but from surviving his desire to hear it. A cloud rose from Charybdis, where the sea poured downward. Across the channel, Scylla's cliff climbed into mist, its highest cave hidden beyond the reach of ordinary arrows. Odysseus put on armor and took 2 spears, hoping to fight what Circe had said could not be fought. The instinct to act felt easier than accepting the limits of action. He remembered too late that stopping to fight would expose the ship longer. The only useful command was forward, so every rower pulled while the current twisted beneath them. On one side, Charybdis drew the water into a vast turning hollow. Sand and dark rock appeared far below, then vanished beneath foam as the sea rose again. To escape the whirlpool, the helmsman held close to the opposite cliff. Above them, the cave remained hidden, and the crew watched the water instead of the danger overhead. Scylla struck quickly and carried away 6 sailors before the ship cleared the rock. The poem gives the lost terrible speed. Our telling leaves the violence unseen and remembers only the suddenly empty benches. Odysseus heard his companions call, but turning back would have surrendered everyone to the strait. He kept the bow toward open water, a choice that survival required and memory would not soften. By evening they saw Nausicaa, bright with grazing herds. Odysseus urged the crew to pass it, but exhaustion and grief made another night at sea feel impossible. Eurylochus argued that sailors were not made of iron and needed food and sleep. He promised they would harm no animal, and the exhausted majority agreed to land. Before anyone left the ship, Odysseus required an oath that the herds would remain untouched. The crew swore and prepared the remaining grain beside the quiet harbor. That night, a southern storm closed the sea. For an entire month, the wind blew against departure, confining the crew to the island while their stored food steadily disappeared. The men searched for fish, birds, and edible plants, but the island offered little beyond the protected herds. Hunger narrowed their attention until every grazing animal seemed to fill the landscape. Odysseus left the camp to pray for a change in weather. Sheltered from the wind, he fell into a deep sleep sent by the gods, leaving the hungry crew without his watch. Eurylochus said that starvation was the hardest death, and proposed sacrificing the finest cattle to the gods. If they returned home, they would build Helios a rich temple in repayment. The crew accepted his argument and broke their oath. The act itself remains beyond the image. We see the sacred herd scattering and the sailors preparing a ritual fire behind a low hill. Strange signs followed. Hides seemed to move, and meat made sounds upon the spits, as though the island itself refused to let an ordinary meal conceal what had happened. Lampetia, daughter of Helios and guardian of the herds, carried news of the offense to her father. The sun god demanded justice from Zeus or threatened to shine among the dead instead. Odysseus woke to the smell of smoke and understood before reaching camp. He could not undo the choice, and the sailors continued eating for 6 days while the wind held them ashore. On the 7th day, the storm stopped. The crew launched immediately, perhaps mistaking open water for escape, while clouds gathered above a sea suddenly empty of every other vessel. A single thunderbolt broke the mast and shattered the ship. The companions were lost in the storm, shown here only by scattered timbers and oars after the wave had passed. Odysseus alone joined the mast and keel with a strip of leather. Sitting upon this narrow wreckage, he drifted back toward the very strait the crew had barely survived. Charybdis swallowed the wreckage, but Odysseus leaped and clung to a fig tree rooted high above the whirlpool. He waited through the long cycle until the timbers returned to the surface. He dropped onto the timbers and paddled away with his hands. For 9 days, wind and current carried him west, until the green island of Ogygia rose from morning mist. There Calypso received him, and there his long account to the Phaeacians finally met the place where their own story had begun. The hall grew quiet as every listener understood the cost of his return. Odysseus finished his account, and the Phaeacian hall remained silent. The listeners had followed him through 10 years of storms, temptations, mistakes, and loss, arriving with him at Calypso's distant shore. King Alcinous rose and promised once more that the stranger would be carried safely home. Every noble would add a gift, replacing some of the wealth Odysseus had lost since Troy. Gold, bronze, clothing, and useful vessels were placed into a polished chest. The collection did not erase the voyage, but it meant Odysseus would not return entirely empty-handed. Queen Arete packed the clothing herself and asked Odysseus to fasten the lid with a complicated knot. A familiar sailor's skill protected the gifts better than a guard could have done. Attendants prepared warm water and clean clothing. After years of salt, smoke, and borrowed garments, the ordinary comfort of bathing felt like another small return to human life. The Phaeacians shared a final meal with their guest. Demodocus played quietly, yet Odysseus watched the western light and measured every moment against the home now within reach. He asked that the sun might set quickly, not from disrespect, but because longing had changed his sense of time. A few remaining hours felt heavier than many former years. Nausicaa met him near the hall and asked to be remembered. Odysseus thanked her for the kindness that began his rescue and promised that her name would remain with his homecoming. At last, the company walked by torchlight toward the harbor. The gifts went aboard first, followed by food, blankets, and everything needed for a voyage expected to end before dawn. The sailors arranged soft rugs and linen on the stern deck. Odysseus lay down while the mooring lines were released, trusting strangers to complete the final distance for him. Before the harbor lights had faded, he entered a deep, unbroken sleep. For once, no warning, memory, or divine message disturbed him. The voyage continued without requiring his attention. The ship moved as swiftly and surely as a falcon, guided by sailors who knew the sea almost without thought. Its bow divided the night while the sleeper remained perfectly still. Constellations turned above the mast as island after island passed unseen. The route that had defeated Odysseus for years became, under Phaeacian skill, one quiet night of travel. Before sunrise, they entered Ithaca's harbor of Phaeacians, enclosed by steep headlands and sheltered from every wind. 2 entrances and a spreading olive tree marked the hidden anchorage. Near the water stood a cave sacred to the nymphs, filled with stone bowls, jars, and looms imagined for divine hands. It offered a dry hiding place above the tide. The sailors lifted Odysseus together with his blankets and placed him gently on the sand. He had crossed the final water asleep, unable to recognize the moment he had pursued so long. They stacked his gifts beside the trunk of the olive tree, safely away from the road. Then they pushed off, leaving no guard because the hidden harbor itself provided protection. From the sea, Poseidon recognized that the Phaeacians had delivered the traveler he opposed. He asked Zeus whether such easy passage had made the sea god's warnings meaningless. Zeus allowed a measured punishment after the sailors reached safety. Their returning ship would become stone near the harbor, a lasting warning against treating every dangerous voyage as effortless. As the crew approached Scheria, Poseidon touched the vessel and fixed it in the water as stone. The sailors were already ashore. Behind them stood the shape of a ship transformed into rock. Alcinous remembered an old prophecy that one returning ship would be struck, and mountains might someday close their harbor. He ordered offerings and asked his people to reconsider distant escorts. On Ithaca, morning light reached Odysseus beneath the olive tree. He woke on unfamiliar sand, surrounded by mist that Athena had placed over the island to protect his return. The mist disguised every hill and path. Odysseus believed the sailors had abandoned him in some unknown country and wondered whether their celebrated kindness had concealed one final betrayal. Before grief became panic, he counted every bronze vessel, garment, and piece of gold. Nothing was missing. That evidence did not explain the landscape, but it corrected his first suspicion. Athena approached, disguised as a young shepherd carrying a spear. To Odysseus, the stranger's appearance was the first ordinary human sign in a place that still seemed unknown. Instead of giving his name, Odysseus invented a tale about being a Cretan fugitive who had left these treasures after a troubled crossing. Even at home, his first defense remained a story. The shepherd smiled and took the form of Athena. She admired the speed of his invention, saying that neither goddess nor man had abandoned the pleasure of strategy. Athena named the harbor, the cave, Mount Narration, and the island's rocky fields. Odysseus touched the ground and welcomed his homeland, though he still kept part of his joy guarded. Odysseus asked why she had not guided him openly through the long voyage. Athena answered that Poseidon's anger required distance, and that she had protected him by quieter means. She described the suitors consuming his stores and pressing Penelope to choose a husband. Telemachus had gone seeking news, and the house could not be entered safely without preparation. Together they carried the Phaeacian gifts into the cave of the nymphs. Athena sealed the entrance with a stone, keeping the recovered wealth outside the coming struggle. They sat beneath the ancient olive tree and considered the household one person at a time. Athena would bring Telemachus home. Odysseus would first learn who remained loyal. Athena directed him toward Eumaeus, the swineherd who had protected the estate despite poverty and pressure. His remote hut offered shelter, information, and a first test of Ithacan hospitality. To conceal him, Athena touched Odysseus with her staff. His skin seemed weathered, his hair thinned, and fine clothing became the patched cloak of an elderly traveler. The disguise changed what others would see, not the disciplined mind beneath it. Odysseus tested his staff, settled the rough cloak, and prepared to walk through his own island unnoticed. Athena departed to guide Telemachus away from Sparta and past the suitors' ambush. Their separate routes would meet at Eumaeus' hut before either entered the troubled palace. Odysseus climbed from the harbor through terraces of olive and stone. Each turn revealed places changed by 20 years, familiar in shape yet distant from the memory he carried. Somewhere beyond the ridges stood his own hall, filled with people who would not recognize him. He resisted the shortest road and followed Athena's slower path toward knowledge. The sun crossed the island as he walked toward the shepherd country. For the first time in the poem, the sea lay behind Odysseus, and every immediate road led deeper into home. He had reached the place he wanted, yet return was not complete. Homecoming would require recognition, trust, and the patient restoration of relationships that distance had left uncertain. Disguised as an elderly wanderer, Odysseus crossed the rough eastern hills of Ithaca. Smoke from a lonely farm rose beyond oak and thorn, marking the home of Eumaeus, keeper of the royal swine. Eumaeus had built the place himself, a broad yard, 12 pens, a defensive wall of stone and timber, and shelter enough for animals and workers far from the neglected palace. 4 strong dogs charged the stranger as he neared the gate. Odysseus dropped his staff and sat calmly on the ground, choosing stillness instead of provoking animals trained to guard. Eumaeus ran from the yard, scattered the dogs with stones, and helped the visitor rise. He apologized before asking a name, because in his view a stranger's need came before his history. Inside the hut, Eumaeus spread fresh branches and covered them with a thick goatskin. The seat was simple, yet its careful preparation carried the same respect shown in more splendid halls. He roasted a modest portion, divided it fairly, and poured wine saved from the estate. Though suitors consumed the best animals daily, Eumaeus still shared what remained with an unknown guest. As they ate, Eumaeus spoke bitterly of the men occupying his master's house. He believed Odysseus dead, but loyalty to the absent king shaped every decision he made. No future employer, he said, could equal the kindness Odysseus had shown him. Even the thought of greater wealth elsewhere could not replace the belonging he associated with that household. Odysseus declared that the missing king would return within the year. Eumaeus refused to believe another traveler's promise, having heard too many invented reports offered for food or clothing. The swineherd asked his guest not to flatter him with false comfort. Shelter would be given freely, he explained, and therefore needed no story designed to earn it. Invited at last to explain himself, Odysseus created another Cretan past. He described noble parents, a difficult inheritance, restless courage, and expeditions that repeatedly pulled him away from home. The stranger claimed to have commanded Cretan ships at Troy and returned safely, only to seek adventure again in Egypt. Pride, poor judgment, and chance had then scattered his fortune. In the tale, raiders attacked Egyptian farms against his orders. The supposed Cretan surrendered directly to the local king, who recognized his plea and protected him from the angry crowd. He said he remained in Egypt for 7 prosperous years before a dishonest Phoenician merchant persuaded him aboard another ship. The story mixed hardship with details familiar enough to sound lived. The merchant planned betrayal, but Zeus broke the ship near Thesprotia. The traveler survived, learned that Odysseus was nearby gathering wealth, and eventually reached Ithaca after further misfortune. Eumaeus pitied the visitor but separated compassion from belief. Odysseus might never return, he said, and Penelope had already suffered enough from strangers trading uncertain rumors. He explained that Telemachus had sailed to Pylos in Sparta searching for reliable news. The suitors had placed a ship in ambush, hoping to remove the household's last young protector. Penelope still delayed remarriage, but pressure tightened around her. Eumaeus spoke of her with respect, describing a household held together through intelligence rather than physical power. Old Laertes rarely visited town. He slept near the orchard in rough clothing and grieved for his son, finding more peace among trees and field workers than in the troubled palace. At sunset, workers drove the herds into their pens and greeted the guest. Eumaeus organized the evening meal, locked every gate, and counted the animals entrusted to his care. Night brought rain and a sharp western wind. Odysseus wondered whether Eumaeus would notice his thin cloak without a direct request, testing care through a story rather than complaint. He recalled an invented night outside Troy when Odysseus cleverly sent a messenger back to camp, leaving behind a warm cloak for a freezing companion to use. The swineherd praised the tale and immediately lent his own thick cloak to the guest. He did not need the indirect lesson explained. Compassion completed the unfinished sentence. Eumaeus chose to sleep outside near the animals, wrapped against the rain and armed only for ordinary thieves. Odysseus watched him go and felt quiet satisfaction in such steady loyalty. The next day, Eumaeus described the island of Syria, where his father had ruled a peaceful community. A Phoenician servant and visiting traders secretly arranged to carry the child away. After the voyage, Laertes purchased the boy, and Anticlea raised him kindly beside her own children. Enslavement had shaped his life, but humane treatment created the loyalty the palace now depended upon. Far away, Athena appeared to Telemachus in sleep and urged him to return. She warned that relatives were pressing Penelope toward marriage and that suitors waited along his sea route. At dawn, Menelaus gave him a silver mixing bowl crafted long ago, while Helen offered a woven garment for his future bride. The gifts joined hospitality across generations. As the travelers departed, an eagle carried a goose across their path. Helen interpreted the sign as Odysseus returning to his house and overcoming those who had taken advantage of it. Telemachus and Pisistratus spent one night at Pheræ, then continued toward Pylos. The road retraced his outward journey, but he now carried information, confidence, and urgent responsibility. Near Pylos, Telemachus asked Pisistratus to drive directly to the ship. He respected Nestor, yet feared that the generous king's elaborate hospitality would delay an urgent departure. At the shore, a prophet named Theoclymenus asked for passage away from enemies pursuing him. Telemachus accepted the stranger, repeating the hospitality he had received throughout his own search. Telemachus ordered the helmsman to avoid the channel watched by the suitors. The vessel sailed through darkness among islands, guided by experience, caution, and Athena's favorable wind. At first light, Ithaca's ridges appeared ahead. Telemachus did not return directly to the palace. Athena's instructions led him toward the remote coast nearest Eumaeus's farm. A hawk flew past holding a dove, and Theoclymenus read the sign as proof that Telemachus's family would remain powerful on Ithaca. Hope arrived before anyone knew Odysseus was already ashore. Telemachus sent the ship and gifts toward the main harbor, asking a trusted companion to shelter Theoclymenus. Separating the group kept his own destination hidden from those watching the roads. He climbed through wet fields as morning warmed the island. Ahead, smoke rose from the same hut where his father sat disguised, listening to Eumaeus begin another day. Before Telemachus reached the yard, the guard dogs ran toward him with wagging tails instead of barks. Inside, Odysseus noticed their welcome and heard familiar footsteps approach. Eumaeus dropped the bowl in his hands and hurried forward, kissing the young man's head and hands. He welcomed Telemachus like a child returned from danger, with relief too immediate to conceal. From the shadow of the hut, Odysseus watched his grown son receive that affection. He had imagined this meeting across many years, but wisdom required him to remain an old stranger a little longer. Eumaeus led Telemachus into the hut and offered his own seat. The disguised Odysseus rose politely, but the young man stopped him, saying another place could be found without displacing an elderly guest. After food was shared, Telemachus quietly asked who the visitor was and how he had reached Ithaca. Eumaeus repeated the Cretan story and suggested that the palace might offer the wanderer better support. Telemachus admitted that he lacked the power to protect a guest there. The suitors filled every room, and his household had no brothers or close male relatives ready to stand beside him. Odysseus asked why the island tolerated such abuse. He spoke with carefully measured anger, wondering whether Telemachus had enemies by birth or had simply been denied enough loyal companions. Telemachus traced his narrow family line from Laertes to Odysseus and then to himself. The household strength had depended on a single person in each generation, leaving no broad circle of defenders. He asked Eumaeus to go secretly to Penelope and tell her that her son had returned safely. The news must not reach the suitors until Telemachus understood what waited in town. Eumaeus took his staff and started down the long path toward the palace. Once the dogs and his footsteps faded, father and son remained alone beside the quiet fire. Athena appeared outside in the form of a tall woman, visible only to Odysseus and the dogs. The animals withdrew softly, and Telemachus sensed nothing beyond a change in the light. She signaled that concealment between father and son had lasted long enough. Before entering the palace, they needed trust, a shared plan, and the courage that recognition could restore. Athena touched Odysseus with her staff. His cloak became clean, his shoulders straightened, and dark hair returned. Within moments, the elderly visitor appeared as a strong traveler in mature years. Telemachus stared and moved toward the wall, believing a god had replaced the stranger. He asked the radiant figure for mercy, unable to imagine a human explanation for such sudden change. Odysseus answered simply that he was not a god, but the father whose absence had shaped Telemachus's whole life. He touched his son's shoulder and allowed tears long restrained to come. The young man could not accept it at once. Perhaps, he thought, some deity was creating another illusion. The father he remembered existed mostly in other people's stories and a few childhood impressions. Odysseus described Athena's disguise and her ability to change what mortal eyes perceived. He named the hidden harbor and Phaeacian voyage, offering details no visiting stranger could have learned that morning. At last, Telemachus crossed the space between them. Father and son held each other and wept openly, their voices compared to seabirds calling above, a nest suddenly emptied and found again. They sat together and began fitting separate histories into one room. Telemachus spoke of growing without certainty. Odysseus spoke only enough of the voyage to explain why homecoming had taken so long. Odysseus explained that the Phaeacians had brought him sleeping to Ithaca with generous gifts now hidden in the cave. Athena had ordered secrecy until the disorder within the household could be measured. Telemachus named the suitors from Ithaca and neighboring islands. Their number was overwhelming, far beyond what two men could challenge openly, even if one of them was Odysseus. Odysseus asked whether Zeus and Athena would be sufficient allies. The question did not remove practical danger. It reminded Telemachus that courage could include powers the suitors had never considered. The plan began with separation. Telemachus would return openly, while Eumaeus later guided the disguised beggar into town. No glance or gesture could reveal their connection before the proper moment. Odysseus warned that the suitors might mock or strike the beggar. Telemachus must remain outwardly calm because immediate defense would expose the plan before doors, weapons, and loyalties were secured. At the right time, Telemachus would carry the spears and shields from the hall into a locked chamber. If questioned, he would blame smoke damage and fear of a drunken quarrel. They would test Eumaeus and the cowherd Phaeacians before trusting them. Service alone did not prove loyalty, yet years of conduct suggested these two might stand with the household when asked. Neither Penelope nor Laertes could know yet that Odysseus had returned. Their honest joy might become visible to servants, and a single rumor could give the suitors time to organize. Before Eumaeus returned, Athena renewed the disguise. Telemachus watched his father's strength disappear beneath wrinkles and patched cloth, now understanding that the frail appearance concealed a deliberate weapon. At the palace, Eumaeus found Penelope and quietly reported that Telemachus was safe on Ithaca. Relief passed across her face, followed immediately by fear of the men who had waited to ambush him. The ambush vessel entered harbor soon afterward, having discovered that Telemachus had slipped around them. Its frustrated crew hurried toward the meeting place, embarrassed that a younger sailor had defeated their watch. Antinous urged the group to kill Telemachus before the island learned of their failure. He feared that the young man's voyage had given him confidence enough to speak against them publicly. Amphinomus refused to attack without first asking the gods. Although still part of the destructive company, he sometimes recognized limits that Antinous ignored, and the meeting ended without agreement. Hearing the rumor, Penelope entered the hall and accused Antinous of plotting against her son despite the help Odysseus once gave his father. Her direct words briefly silenced the gathering. Eurymachus answered with soothing language and promised that no one would harm Telemachus. Because he secretly supported the plot, his graceful speech demonstrated how courtesy can become a covering for danger. His message delivered, Eumaeus left the palace before darkness. A messenger from Telemachus's ship passed him on the road, ensuring that the public and private announcements would not contradict each other. Back at the farm, Eumaeus found Telemachus and the old stranger sharing food. Neither revealed what had happened in his absence, and the secret remained hidden within ordinary conversation. Odysseus noticed that Eumaeus returned carrying his spear differently and asked whether the town was unsettled. The swineherd reported seeing the ambush ship enter harbor with armed men aboard. For one brief moment, Telemachus met the beggar's eyes. Eumaeus saw nothing unusual, but the glance confirmed that their enemies were alarmed and the plan must move forward without delay. Rain softened across the roof while the three men settled to sleep. This was Telemachus's last night knowing his father only in secret, and Odysseus's last night outside his own household. At first light, Telemachus tied his sandals, took his spear, and repeated each instruction. He would enter town as the returning son, conceal the father, and remove the weapons when signaled. He started toward the palace alone, where his survival would surprise allies and enemies alike. The path descended into morning mist, carrying him from the protected farm into public view. Odysseus remained with Eumaeus until the proper hour. He adjusted the old cloak and leaned upon his staff, preparing to see his home, wife, servants, and enemies without being seen himself. Father and son now moved toward the same house by different roads and identities. Their reunion had lasted only a few hours, but it transformed both journeys into one deliberate homecoming. Telemachus reached the palace first and leaned his spear against a column. Eurycleia saw him, dropped what she carried, and welcomed the young traveler with tears while other loyal servants gathered around. Penelope descended from her room and held Telemachus closely, touching his face as though confirming that rumor had become reality. She asked what he had learned about the father neither could forget. He described Nestor, Menelaus, and the report that Odysseus had lived on Calypso's island. He carefully omitted the newest truth, protecting his father even while standing within his mother's hopeful gaze. The prophet Theoclymenus arrived and declared that Odysseus was already on Ithaca, preparing his return. His insight came close to the secret, yet Penelope had heard too many promises to surrender fully to it. Later, Eumaeus guided the disguised Odysseus toward town. The swineherd walked at an easy pace for the old man's sake, describing farms, paths, and people whose loyalties had shifted during the absence. Near a stone fountain, they met Melanthius, a goatherd who supported the suitors. He insulted both travelers and kicked at the beggar, never suspecting the identity hidden beneath the patched cloak. Odysseus considered answering force with force, then continued walking. The restraint was not weakness. It preserved the larger plan and allowed Melanthius to reveal his character without prompting. At a rise, Eumaeus pointed toward the palace. Music and voices drifted from its courtyard while smoke from continual feasting rose above a roof Odysseus had once known in peace. Beside the gate lay Argos, once a swift hunting dog, now very old and neglected. His ears lifted when Odysseus approached, and his tail moved against the dust in immediate recognition. Odysseus turned his face and quietly wiped away a tear before Eumaeus could notice. He asked about the dog as if they had never met, protecting the secret from the one creature who knew him. After seeing his master home, Argos lowered his head and died peacefully. The scene closes a small circle of loyalty, granting the old animal the recognition he had waited 20 years to receive. Odysseus entered his own courtyard behind Eumaeus. No voice welcomed him by name. Instead, he studied doorways, tables, servants, and exits through the narrowed expectations placed upon a beggar. From his place in the hall, Telemachus gave Eumaeus bread and meat for the stranger. He also instructed the beggar to approach each suitor, turning the request for food into a test of character. Odysseus moved slowly from couch to couch with an open hand. Some men offered small portions, more from custom than kindness, while others joked about the stranger's age and clothing. Antinous demanded to know who had brought another mouth into the hall. Eumaeus defended the universal duty owed to travelers, reminding everyone that strangers, workers, and poets all carried needs beyond their control. When Odysseus answered steadily, Antinous threw a small footstool that struck his shoulder. The beggar remained standing and offered only a warning that injustice eventually creates its own answer. Telemachus felt the insult as if it had struck him, yet obeyed the plan and stayed still. Beneath the table, his hand closed once and then relaxed around nothing. Upstairs, Penelope learned that a well-traveled stranger claimed to possess news of Odysseus. She asked Eumaeus to arrange a private conversation after the suitors had finished their evening noise. Another beggar called Iris resented the newcomer and proposed a contest encouraged by the suitors. Odysseus revealed just enough strength beneath his rags to make the challenger reconsider too late. The struggle ended with one controlled blow, and Iris was carried to the courtyard without lasting description. Odysseus avoided display, proving that power could remain measured even when an audience demanded spectacle. Odysseus spoke privately to Amphinomus, praising his thoughtful manner and advising him to leave before the householder returned. The decent suitor understood the warning but remained bound by pride and company. Athena inspired Penelope to appear before the suitors and remind them that proper courtship brought gifts to a household rather than consuming its stores. The reversal exposed how far custom had been distorted. Penelope stood beneath the veil at the edge of the feast. Even after years of grief, her composure transformed the room, and each suitor briefly imagined that his own attention had caused it. One offered a jeweled brooch, another a necklace, and others fine cloth or worked gold. Their competition returned a portion of wealth to the household even as their motives remained selfish. A servant named Melantho, favored by Penelope in childhood but now aligned with the suitors, ordered the stranger to leave. Odysseus answered that fortune changes and that cruelty is dangerous and borrowed security. Eurymachus suggested the beggar was too lazy for honest fieldwork. Odysseus replied with a calm comparison of their abilities, imagining a day of mowing, plowing, or standing together in danger. Angered by the answer, Eurymachus threw a stool, but Odysseus bent aside and it struck no one important. The hall erupted until Telemachus stood and demanded an end to the evening. He told the suitors to return to their homes and sleep. They mocked his new authority yet slowly departed, surprised by a confidence that had not been present before his voyage. When the room emptied, Telemachus and Odysseus carried helmets, shields, and spears into a secure chamber. Athena held a golden light above them while servants saw only darkness. Later, Penelope sat across the hearth from the beggar and asked about his origin. Odysseus repeated the Cretan identity, shaping each detail carefully while looking upon his wife after 20 years. To test him, she asked what Odysseus had worn before Troy. The stranger described a purple cloak, a golden brooch, and the name of a herald with precision that no casual rumor could contain. The details dissolved Penelope's composure, though the man who caused her tears sat within reach. Odysseus held his expression steady, compared inwardly to a cliff resisting winter rain. He told her that Odysseus was alive and would reach Ithaca before the current moon ended. Penelope thanked him but reserved belief, protecting herself from another hope that might vanish. Penelope ordered Euryclea to wash the guest's feet, an intimate service the old nurse accepted. Odysseus turned from the light, suddenly remembering the scar above his knee. Her fingers found the old wound received during a youthful boar hunt with his grandfather. The basin fell, water spread across the floor, and Euryclea looked directly into the face she had known as a child. Euryclea reached toward Penelope, but Odysseus gently stopped her and required silence. Athena distracted the queen from the fallen basin while the nurse promised to keep the return secret. Penelope described a dream in which an eagle destroyed 20 geese in her courtyard, then spoke with her husband's voice. She understood its apparent meaning, but feared that some dreams passed through deceptive gates. She had decided to bring out Odysseus's great bow. Whoever could string it and send an arrow through 12 aligned axe heads would receive her hand, ending years of delay. Odysseus approved the contest, saying its true owner would arrive before any suitor completed it. Penelope heard encouragement from a stranger. He heard the door of his identity beginning to open. The palace settled into uneasy sleep. The bow remained locked away, the wall weapons hidden, and two people separated by a few steps carried different versions of the same approaching morning. Odysseus slept only briefly before dawn. From the courtyard came the sound of servants beginning their work, while somewhere above, Penelope prayed for an end to the uncertainty that had filled her house. He asked Zeus for a sign, and thunder sounded from a cloudless morning. Nearby, a tired no-worker also prayed that this would be the suitor's final feast, unknowingly answering his hope. The loyal cowherd Phaeacians came from the mainland with animals for the feast. Seeing the old beggar, he was reminded of Odysseus and wept for a master he still believed might return. Melanthius followed with goats and fresh insults, confident that the palace belonged to his new companions. The contrast between the two herdsmen made loyalty and betrayal visible before either was formally tested. Suitors filled the hall again, taking their customary places as though every morning would repeat forever. Telemachus seated the beggar near the threshold and warned that no guest should be mistreated. A wealthy suitor named Ctesippus mocked the stranger by throwing an ox hoof across the room. Odysseus leaned aside and the object struck the wall while Telemachus rose in controlled anger. Telemachus said that only luck had prevented bloodshed and ordered the men to respect his home. For the first time, his authority sounded complete rather than borrowed from the father they dismissed. Athena clouded the suitors' judgment, and their laughter became uncontrolled while tears appeared in their eyes. Theoclymenus saw the hall symbolically darkened and warned that disaster stood close around them. The suitors mocked his vision, so Theoclymenus departed for a safer house. Like Amphinomus, they had received a warning. Unlike the prophet, they chose the comfort of the crowd over departure. Upstairs, Penelope unlocked the chamber holding Odysseus's bow. The polished key turned, the doors opened, and the familiar weapon rested in its case beside gifts from an earlier friendship. Long before Troy, Iphitus had given the bow to Odysseus, who offered a sword and spear in return. Their friendship ended too soon, leaving the bow as a memory of peaceful exchange. Penelope carried the bow into the hall and stated the test, string it, then send one arrow through 12 axe sockets aligned in a row. The suitors accepted, certain strength alone would decide. Telemachus dug a straight trench and planted each axe head with practiced care. The work showed that the supposed child of the household now understood tools, measurement, and the burden of procedure. He tried to string his father's bow and nearly succeeded on the 4th attempt. A quiet signal from Odysseus made him stop, preserving the older plan rather than proving himself too early. Leodes, who served as the suitor's ritual attendant, took the bow first. His hands could not bend it, and he predicted that the weapon would bring sorrow to the company gathered there. One man after another strained against the wood without success. Their arms were powerful, but none possessed the familiarity, balance, and practiced knowledge the bow required from its owner. Melanthius brought fat and hot coals to soften the bow. Even with heat and careful rubbing, Eurymachus could not string it, and his embarrassment mattered more to him than the violated household. While the attempts continued, Odysseus slipped into the courtyard where Eumaeus and Phaeacians stood together. He asked what they would do if their missing master suddenly returned that day. Both men prayed that such a return might happen and promised to stand with Odysseus. Their grief was unperformed, built from years of maintaining duties while others treated the estate as abandoned. Odysseus named himself and showed the familiar scar, along with details of trees once given to each servant. Recognition passed through them with tears, but he quickly brought attention back to the plan. Phaeacians would lock the courtyard gate and secure it with rope. Eumaeus would carry the bow to the beggar despite every protest, then tell the women to close their doors upstairs. Inside, Antinous proposed postponing the contest until the festival of Apollo. He ordered another feast, hoping a better sacrifice or a different morning would restore the confidence already leaving the room. Odysseus asked to test the bow without competing for Penelope. The suitors reacted with anger and nervous laughter, fearing that an old wanderer might succeed where every noble had failed. Penelope reminded them that the stranger could not carry her away merely by stringing a weapon. She offered clothing and safe passage as a fair reward if he completed the test. Telemachus respectfully claimed responsibility for the bow and asked his mother to return to her room. Penelope was surprised by his tone, yet accepted that the household's child had become its acting guardian. The swineherd lifted the bow, hesitated beneath the suitor's threats, then obeyed Telemachus and placed it in Odysseus's hands. Euryclea quietly closed the women's doors as instructed. Odysseus turned the bow slowly, checking it for damage or substitution. His hands moved with a craftsperson's familiarity, tracing horn, wood, and string while the hall watched in growing silence. He bent the bow and set the string as easily as a skilled musician tightens a lyre. When he plucked it, the clear note crossed the room and startled the watching suitors. Thunder sounded outside, and Odysseus recognized Zeus's second sign. He raised a single arrow while Telemachus moved quietly to his side with spear and shield already prepared. The arrow passed cleanly through all 12 openings and struck the far wall. Nothing in the movement was hurried. Years of absence narrowed into one precise line across his own floor. Odysseus told his son that the stranger had not disgraced the feast. Telemachus fastened his sword, took position beside him, and the quiet cooperation of the hut entered the public hall. The old posture fell away as Odysseus declared that the trials were over and the owner had returned. The suitors searched the walls for weapons that Telemachus had already removed. The first arrow ended Antinous' leadership while he lifted a cup. Our view remains on the fallen vessel and wine spreading across the table, leaving the violent moment outside the frame. Eurymachus blamed everything on Antinous and offered repayment from the survivor's property. Odysseus rejected the bargain because stolen goods could not restore years of fear, conspiracy, and abused hospitality. Odysseus, Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Phaeacians stood together near the doorway. Spears passed between them, the courtyard remained locked, and Athena's unseen presence strengthened their measured defense. Melanthius climbed into the storeroom and carried armor to the suitors before Eumaeus discovered the route. The loyal servants secured him there, closing the last opening in their careful plan. At the height of the struggle, Athena appeared near the roof beam and displayed her protective shield. The suitors' final resistance collapsed beneath recognition that the house no longer stood alone. The contest ended, and sudden silence filled a hall that had been noisy for years. The telling leaves the dead beyond view and rests instead on extinguished lamps, overturned tables, and open space. Disloyal servants were identified and removed from the household without lingering description. Euryclea helped restore order, while Odysseus purified the rooms with water, fire, and cleansing smoke. The doors stayed closed, and musicians created the sound of a wedding so neighbors would not gather. Above, Penelope slept unaware that the bow had found its owner and the hall had changed. Euryclea hurried toward Penelope's room with the energy of someone suddenly young. She announced that Odysseus had returned and that the stranger below was the husband whose scar her own hands had recognized. Penelope thought grief or age had confused the nurse. 20 years of false reports had trained her to resist sudden certainty, especially certainty offered in the middle of a troubled night. Euryclea described the scar and the bow, yet Penelope suggested that a god might have punished the suitors while Odysseus remained dead elsewhere. Evidence required interpretation, and she would not surrender judgment. At last, she descended and sat opposite Odysseus. The cleared hall lay between them, and she studied the man in silence, comparing the face before her with memory altered by time. Telemachus accused his mother of having a heart harder than stone. He expected recognition to be immediate, but Penelope understood that a convincing stranger could learn stories, scars, and public signs. Odysseus smiled and asked his son to let them discover each other in their own way. The patience that had carried him through disguise now made room for Penelope's equal caution. To prevent news spreading through town, Odysseus ordered clean clothing, music, and dancing. Anyone outside would think Penelope's marriage had finally begun, rather than suspect the household had changed hands. Eurynomé bathed Odysseus and gave him a fresh cloak. Athena made him appear taller and stronger, yet Penelope still relied not on appearance but on knowledge shared by only two people. Penelope told a servant to carry their marriage bed outside the bedroom and prepare it elsewhere. The instruction sounded ordinary, but it quietly placed a private impossibility before the man claiming to be Odysseus. Odysseus reacted immediately. The bed could not be moved unless someone had cut through its foundation. He had built their room around a living olive tree and shaved its trunk into one bedpost. He described trimming the branches, smoothing the wood, boring the frame, and stretching leather across it. Every practical detail belonged to the young couple who had created a home before the voyage. Penelope's caution dissolved. She crossed the hall and embraced him, explaining that the long years had required suspicion because many people possessed clever words, but only one knew the rooted bed. Their reunion was compared to the shore seen by a swimmer escaping a storm. Each had reached safety through a different endurance, one across seas, the other within a house under siege. Athena slowed the coming dawn so husband and wife could speak without interruption. The night became a sheltered harbor where 20 missing years might begin to find sequence and meaning. Odysseus summarized the Cyclones, Lotus Eaters, Cyclops, Circe, Underworld, Sirens, and Calypso. This telling differed from the Phaeacian performance because its listener had lived every delay from the other side. Penelope described the suitors, the loom, Telemachus's growth, and the daily calculations required to preserve choice. Her homebound story contained its own disguises, risks, and long navigation through uncertainty. Odysseus also revealed that home was not the absolute end. Someday he must carry an oar inland until strangers mistook it for a winnowing fan, then make peace with Poseidon. When their stories were joined, they rested in the room grown around the olive tree. Unlike Calypso's cave or the Phaeacian deck, this sleep belonged to a place they had made together. Athena released the dawn, and pale light entered Ithaca. Odysseus rose before public news could spread, knowing that the families of the suitors would soon demand an account. With Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Phaeacians, he left for Laertes' country farm. The group moved quietly through orchard paths while Athena concealed them from people carrying news toward town. They found old trees carefully tended despite the household's trouble. Straight rows, repaired walls, and pruned branches revealed that Laertes had turned grief into patient work rather than abandonment. Odysseus saw his father wearing a patched tunic, leather gloves, and a cap against thorns. Age had bent him, but he still moved thoughtfully among the trees he had planted. Unable to resist testing recognition, Odysseus approached as a foreign traveler and praised the orchard. He claimed to have hosted Laertes' absent son years earlier in a distant country. Laertes asked for news, then covered his head with dust when the visitor offered only an old memory. Seeing his father's grief directly, Odysseus regretted extending the uncertainty even a little longer. Odysseus named himself, showed the scar, and recalled every tree Laertes had given him as a child. Pears, apples, figs, and rows of vines counted during their walks. Laertes accepted the proof and held his son, overwhelmed that both Odysseus and Telemachus stood safe before him. 3 generations of a narrow family line had gathered in one orchard. Dolius and the farm servants returned from work, recognized Odysseus, and prepared a meal. The quiet country household restored familiar roles more naturally than the palace could after its long disruption. Meanwhile, the suitors' families learned what had happened and gathered in the town square. Grief, anger, and confusion mixed together before the full history of the occupied household could be considered. The herald Medon explained that divine power had stood beside Odysseus in the hall. His testimony encouraged some families to remain home, recognizing that another violent response might deepen the loss. The elder Halitherses recalled how often he had warned against the suitors' behavior. Responsibility, he said, belonged partly to families who allowed years of disorder to continue without correction. Antinous' father Eupeithes could not accept restraint and led an armed group toward Laertes' farm. His grief was real, but it narrowed into the same impulsive action that had already damaged Ithaca. Above the island, Athena asked Zeus whether conflict should continue. He answered that Odysseus had rightfully returned, and that lasting peace now required memory to stop serving as fuel for revenge. A servant noticed the approaching group, and the reunited household armed itself. Even Laertes took a spear, newly strengthened by Athena and unwilling to lose the family just restored. Laertes cast first, and Eupeithes fell. But the telling turns away from further detail. Telemachus and Odysseus moved forward until Athena's voice stopped both sides before another generation was consumed. Athena ordered the Ithacans to lay down their weapons, and thunder confirmed the command. Fear released its hold, spears dropped onto grass one after another until the field became quiet. The goddess established an agreement between Odysseus and the community. Families would be remembered, property restored, and the island governed without turning every grievance into an inherited obligation for revenge. The household walked toward town with Laertes among them. Orchard paths that had carried isolated grief now carried father, son, and grandson in conversation beneath trees planted across their lives. At the palace, Penelope waited beside the olive-wood threshold. She saw not a solitary adventurer, but a family returning, accompanied by workers whose loyalty had kept the estate alive. Fresh fire burned in the central hearth, meals were prepared from honest stores, and doors opened without fear. Restoration appeared not as luxury, but as ordinary tasks performed without coercion. At the center of this renewed home remained the bed rooted in living wood. Ships, palaces, names, and fortunes had shifted, but the secret foundation endured because it was cultivated rather than carried. The Odyssey existed in voices before it settled into the written form we know. Generations of performers shaped familiar scenes in halls and gathering places, using rhythm and repeated phrases to carry an enormous story through memory. A performer did not simply recite a fixed modern script. Within a shared tradition, each telling could adjust its pace and emphasis to the occasion, allowing listeners to recognize an old route while noticing different waves along it. Ancient audiences connected the poem with Homer, yet modern scholars still debate how one poet, several performers, and a long tradition contributed to its surviving form. The uncertainty does not diminish the achievement, it reveals its depth. Dawn often arrives with familiar beauty, ships repeatedly cross dark water, and heroes receive recurring descriptions. Such patterns gave singers dependable structures, much as a sailor relies on stars while improvising around weather. The central word is homecoming, but the poem includes many returns: Telemachus from Sparta, Menelaus from wandering, Agamemnon into danger, and Odysseus into a home that must first learn who he is. Ithaca can be reached by ship in one night, yet true return requires recognition, restored responsibility, and peace with other people. The poem separates arrival from belonging, showing why the last miles can be emotionally longest. Hospitality, often called xenia, organizes almost every episode. A host offers food, shelter, and questions and not order. A guest shows restraint and gratitude. Communities reveal themselves by how faithfully they honor this exchange. Nestor, Menelaus, the Phaeacians, Eumaeus, and even humble workers welcome strangers before demanding proof. Polyphemus and the suitors reverse that pattern, consuming others' resources while treating vulnerability as an opportunity. Athena repeatedly appears in ordinary disguises, making hospitality more than etiquette. Anyone at the threshold might carry hidden significance, and kindness offered without certainty becomes a practical form of respect for the unknown. Odysseus is defined by adaptable intelligence, or metis, the ability to read conditions, disguise intention, and discover an indirect path. It is the intelligence of sailors, craftspeople, storytellers, and anyone working with changing materials. The Cyclops escape succeeds through planning, but the shouted name afterward turns success into prolonged trouble. The poem admires cleverness without pretending it is automatically wisdom. Intelligence must still learn when silence is stronger. Odysseus calls himself nobody, invents several Cretan identities, and withholds his name at home. Identity in the poem is not a single label, but a relationship between memory, evidence, reputation, and the listener's trust. People recognize Odysseus through things that carry private history: a scar, a bow, a brooch, orchard trees, and the immovable bed. Objects become archives, preserving knowledge that public speeches cannot convincingly imitate. Penelope is not merely waiting. The loom delays the suitors, the gift request reverses their consumption, and the bed test protects her from deception. Her intelligence is architectural, creating time and secure boundaries. By weaving each day and undoing work at night, Penelope controls when her task can be called complete. Her loom resembles oral storytelling, where patterns are constructed, revisited, and held open until the right ending arrives. The young man begins uncertain in his own hall, then learns to question elders, travel among strangers, and speak with authority. His journey is shorter than his father's, but equally concerned with becoming recognizable. Eumaeus receives no palace throne, yet his choices make restoration possible. He keeps the animals, welcomes a beggar, protects Telemachus, and remains trustworthy when loyalty offers no immediate reward or public applause. The old dog receives no explanation and needs no test. He recognizes by scent, movement, or something deeper than disguise, giving the poem its simplest homecoming before the human household can manage the same act. Water separates islands, but it also mirrors uncertainty. Its surface can be calm above hidden current, and every horizon conceals weather. The sea externalizes the condition of a traveler who never holds complete information. Each island offers a different arrangement of life, forgetfulness, appetite, immortality, perfect sailing, isolation, or disciplined community. Odysseus repeatedly sees alternatives to Ithaca and discovers why ease alone cannot define home. The Lotus Eaters threaten no one with force. Their danger is pleasant release from obligation, suggesting that a journey can end through forgetting as completely as through shipwreck. Memory becomes both burden and compass. Calypso offers safety, beauty, and freedom from aging, yet her island excludes the imperfect relationships that make a human life particular. Endless duration is not enough when it cannot be shared with one's history. Circe's island begins with people reduced to appetite and ends as a place of instruction. Transformation there is reversible, reminding us that identity can be obscured by behavior without being permanently lost. Cyclops, Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis occupy edges where familiar rules weaken. They turn ordinary risks, hostile isolation, persuasive knowledge, narrow choices, and overwhelming nature into shapes a listening audience can remember. Among the dead, Odysseus receives prophecy, family news, unresolved conflict, and competing views of glory. The underworld stores what the living have not finished, making memory essential but never fully comfortable. At Troy, heroic fame seemed worth almost any price. In the underworld, Achilles values ordinary life above rule among the dead. The poem allows its greatest warrior to question the bargain that created his reputation. The Odyssey comes from a warrior culture and contains severe reckonings. Yet violence rarely closes the moral account by itself. Losses produce grief, families demand answers, and peace requires intervention after victory. The poem remembers palaces, bronze weapons, chariots, and sea-born kingdoms associated with an earlier Greek world. But its language and social details also carry centuries of change between remembered events and recorded poetry. Archaeology reveals wealthy centers, trade networks, destruction layers, and migrations around the eastern Mediterranean. It cannot identify every mythic journey, but it helps us understand the material world from which such memories could grow. Readers have placed the wandering across many real coastlines, from Greece to Italy and beyond. No route wins universal agreement, and the poem's geography often serves wonder and meaning more faithfully than nautical measurement. The poem survives partly because exile and return are widely understood. People leave for war, work, curiosity, necessity, or accident, then discover that both traveler and household have changed before reunion becomes possible. Odysseus loses years he cannot recover, while Penelope, Telemachus, Laertes, Eumaeus, and Argos experience those same years at home. Absence is shared unevenly. The missing person never owns all of its consequences. Again and again, Odysseus survives by arranging experience into language. His tales earn shelter, delay danger, conceal identity, and finally explain loss. Narration becomes another vessel, carrying a person across uncertainty toward recognition. The Phaeacians do more than provide food and transport. They give a stranger time to tell the full shape of his suffering. Care includes listening long enough for another person's scattered events to become a comprehensible life. Tiresias imagines Odysseus carrying an oar until someone mistakes it for a tool that separates grain. The journey ends where the sea's familiar object becomes strange, and a weapon of travel becomes a sign of peace. The marriage bed offers the opposite image. An oar travels across water and land, while the bed cannot move without being destroyed. Between them, the poem balances exploration with the human need for rooted continuity. Home is not presented as perfect stillness. Ithaca contains rocky soil, political danger, aging, and future duties. It is valuable because difficulties there belong to relationships. Odysseus accepts rather than enchantments chosen for him. Imagine now the long voyage after its final telling. The sail comes down, ropes settle against the mast, and water inside the breakwater grows smooth, no longer demanding that every horizon become another destination. Small lamps appear at farmhouses and along the palace wall. They are not heroic fires visible across oceans, only ordinary lights kept for family, guests, workers, and travelers expected before the doors close. The sea continues beyond the harbor and future journeys remain possible, but this story rests beneath an olive tree. After every storm, disguise, and distant song, recognition arrives quietly, a known voice, an open door, and roots holding in darkness.